Space Harrier 2, an on-the-rails shooter sequel to the classic 1985 arcade game of the same name. Space Harrier 2, initially released for the Sega Mega Drive, is one of the launch titles for Japan in 1988. It then released in America the following year as one of the 6 launch titles back in 1989, and finally releasing for Europe in 1990. It follows a similar formula to the original 1985 game, which I've covered previously in my arcade port series. We have the same layout of the checkered ground and a forever distant background. We have a total of 13 different stages in this game. At the end of each stage comes a boss. Some stages also have mini bosses halfway through the levels. The game features all diagonal movements as well as up, down, left and right. Of course, difficulty level is fairly high with this game, much like the original game that is, although by pressing the A button at the start of the game we can actually change difficulty levels from here, as well as change shooting to auto fire, which can be really helpful. The Mega Drive original game also lets the player select a stage from the start of the game. Now, this game will likely make you very annoyed very quickly when we hear Harrier has been hit. The Mega Drive original will give you a digitized voice sample of this, and of course at the time of this game's release, digitized voice sampling was a big deal and added something a little extra which kids could wow over. Graphically as a game, it's an impressive rail shooter for its time, and it plays very good. Some argue in its day that it wasn't as great as it was made out to be prior to its release, although many did praise the technicalities behind the game itself for the Mega Drive. So as with anything successful in the 80s and 90s, there needed to be conversions, and so Space Harrier 2 had several of these. So today we are going to find out if any of its conversions was actually better than the Mega Drive exclusive itself. I will note here that there was an MSX conversion, but rest assured it was one of those European releases for the MSX, which was pretty much a ZX Spectrum port. I'll also note here again that anything that released homebrew wise won't be included. As always, this is comparing the original Space Harrier 2 releases from its original run. The ZX Spectrum 48K and 128K computers had a conversion of Space Harrier 2 in 1990. Now let's firstly take a look at it for what it is. I mean, sure, it scrolls beautifully and that pseudo 3D effect is nicely done here too. We even get voice samples here too with the 128K Spectrum models, as well as options at the start of the game. So everything is here, even a fairly good tune which sounds similar to the original Mega Drive game itself. But as for the gameplay, now as much as I wanted to enjoy this version, I couldn't, not really. It was similar to the original Spectrum Space Harrier game. The problem is that with Spectrum's limited number of colours being displayed, it causes issues where colours of projectiles flying towards you can be very difficult to see, as they can often colour clash with the floor area, as they are of the same colour in most cases. I also find that the music, although nicely done here for the spec, it can sometimes actually struggle to maintain its pace, especially when a lot is happening all at once on screen. Controller wise, it controls just fine, very smoothly in fact, and shooting is very responsive too. Although shooting at enemies on the screen can often be very difficult at times due to the colour clash with the flooring area or the distant background causing the issue here. The Commodore 64 received its conversion of Space Harrier 2 in 1990, also by Grand Slam. This is a decent and very faithful 8-bit computer conversion, although it's tough as hell, or that's likely just me being terrible at this game altogether. Personally, everything looks superb here, but one thing that really stands out in particular is Harrier himself. The sprite is so detailed, and probably one of the best sprites I've seen in a C64 game. The music is fantastic here as per usual for a C64 game. Now, I believe that due to hardware limitations, we do not have a checkered floor here, but instead we have a raster bar look as we are speeding through the various stages. It's kind of like watching the Commodore 64 game load. It's very likely that people who didn't grow up with a C64 would find this effect very trippy, but for veterans of the C64 like myself, it's not too bad, and let's just face it, Space Harrier games always went for that psychedelic effect in the first place. As for the enemy sprites, they are blocky, but movement for Harrier himself is actually okay. The real issue with this version is the speed of it. It seems to be moving way too fast. I mean, if you didn't have a Sega Mega Drive at the time of the game's release or just couldn't afford one, this conversion wasn't half bad. I have known much worse in terms of conversions for the C64, such as that Chase HQ game, and this game is even fairly bright in colours used too. Now, many C64 games often looked pretty dull in colour compared to other systems such as the Amstrad CPC in Mode 0, but this conversion manages to look fairly bright and nice here. Likely one of the best Amstrad CPC conversions I've ever played, although it does tend to slow down and has a few issues with maintaining a consistent frame rate from time to time when too much is happening at once. The majority of the time this game works perfectly. Although it is a slight slower than most other versions, it actually works to the game's advantage, for me personally that is. A slower game of Space Harrier 2 is just easier to play, so it seems. We have everything with this release from 1990 that looks so great to what it's trying to emulate too. The checkered flooring looks great, as so do the sprites themselves here. It's very likely used in Amstrad's Mode 0 in order to create such a colourful and detailed environment, which the coder clearly knew how to program this for the Amstrad. Many Mode 0 conversions often come across as pure slugfests, which can barely move. This is flawless for what it is. As for the music itself, it sounds pretty good. Of course, not as good as the C64's offering, but sound chips are a different kettle of fish altogether with the 8-bit computers. Moving Harrier on screen is very responsive. All of those diagonal movements work just fine here too. The perception of speed also looks great here too, as we speed along Fantasyland, shooting down all of the nasters. Space Harrier 2 for the Amstrad CPC is testament that if this 8-bit microcomputer was left in capable hands, games could look and play this good. I would likely say that this version was the best version of the 8-bit systems. Okay, let's be practical here. The Commodore Amiga's conversion isn't bad at all. In fact, it scrolls a little smoother than the next version in this video, but it does play a little too speedy for its own good. But is it really perfect altogether? I would likely say no. Let's strip back the eye candy and look at the sound. We only have music here, and for a 16-bit powerhouse computer like the Amiga, I am sure this could have included voice samples or at least sound effects of shooting down enemies. But it doesn't, and let's remember at the time of the Mega Drive's release, the digitized voices would have been a fairly spectacular selling point of a home console having this, and especially for an early Mega Drive release too. In fact, a launch title. Kids wanted on computers what kids had on consoles, and we didn't get this with this Amiga release. This 1989 release by Grandson was actually developed by Teak Software, who was responsible for the next conversion in this video too. Teak Software developed several games at the time, some notably terrible games such as Pit Fighter, but to be fair, even the arcades game wasn't the best. They also developed many average games such as Chase HQ and Badlands for the Amiga. I will say that Space Harrier 2 for the Amiga was an average game. A real shame, as Teak Software was later producing some really impressive games for the Amiga, such as Brutal Sports Series Football and Shadowlands. Now, one nice feature with this Amiga conversion is using the mouse to control Harrier, which to be fair offers a more speedier response when avoiding projectiles. The Atari ST's conversion was a really good play. Again, much like the Amstrad CPC's conversion, Space Harrier 2 for the Atari ST is likely one of the better conversions on this platform. It was an enjoyable play and also offered music which sounded very similar to the Mega Drive game itself, although with that typical ST 8-bit sound. It also includes voice samples too, and also sound effects while shooting, which all works together flawlessly. Now, in terms of speed, it scrolled really well, but again, I totally sucked at playing this game. I should just face it, either most people struggle with playing Space Harrier 2, or it's just me. But regardless, a game like this is a superb game to use as an example for 8-bit and 16-bit computers, because it has so much happening on screen all at once. The sprite designs here are very nicely done, and enemies themselves don't look too bad either. They aren't too blocky, so to speak. Controlling Harrier is nice and fluid, and bosses here are nicely animated too. We also get the nice background distant colour transitions as we play through the game, which again are nice and fluid. We of course get the stage option when the game starts up. This is a very complete Space Harrier 2 16-bit computer conversion, and like I say, likely one of the best conversions is for the Atari ST. Is it just as good as the original Mega Drive Exclusive though? Well, that is down to debate. I would likely say that sure, the original Mega Drive game scrolled much smoother than the ST, but as far as conversions went of Space Harrier 2, I would personally say that the ST had the best conversion of it. It's not exactly the same speed as the Mega Drive game performs at, but for a game like Space Harrier 2, I think a slower pace is actually beneficial. And that's it for ranking every conversion of Space Harrier 2 today. Like I said at the start of the video, I've actually done the original Space Harrier in my arcade sports series, so do check that one out. Anyways, which version of Space Harrier 2 did you have? And did you agree with most reviews at the time that Space Harrier 2 for the Mega Drive wasn't everything that it was cracked up to be? Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.